the way that I'm kind of describing is that it's a history of baseball as told through the life and work of baseball's Picasso, Dick Perez. So Dick Perez has painted literally thousands and thousands of baseball paintings.
Dick Perez has illustrated baseball cards for decades, and as the official artist of the National Baseball Hall of Fame for over 20 years, painted the game's history in every Hall of Fame ballplayer, a project he continues into his 80s. In his new documentary, The Diamond King, director Marq Evans tells the inspiring story of Perez, whose portraits transformed the commemoration of America's most iconic pastime. Welcome to the Washington State Magazine podcast, bringing you stories of Washington State University alumni and more. I'm Larry Clark, editor of the magazine. I talked with Marq, a WSU business alum, about making the documentary Perez, Baseball, and Art.
Yeah, my name is Marq Evans. I'm a documentary filmmaker, mostly. I also teach film. I also work on other projects that I think are fun, but we're here talking about a documentary, and that's kind of what I spend most of my time on. Washington State business graduate in 2003.
Really excited to talk to you today about The Diamond King, which is your third documentary. Is that correct?
Third or fourth, depending on how you want to count it. I've got a film that I made with my brother that we started in 2010. That was a 15-year journey. We just now started submitting it to film festivals. So depending on where you want to put that, that was the very first film I ever started working on. But, so I made 3 feature films, couple, short films and stuff in the meantime. And then now we finally finished that one.
So before we start about talking about The Diamond King in particular, what's that film that you're now getting out to festivals?
Yeah. So, it was really, this film was like my film school. So 2010, I had kind of already had a career going in with like sales and sales management, and was doing pretty well professionally, but not loving what I was doing. Not feeling super fulfilled, and wanted to do something maybe a little bit more creative, maybe a little more entrepreneurial. It just so happened that my older stepbrother had been in the film industry, kind of like, started sweeping floors, getting people coffee, and he'd started to kind of working his way up. He'd made a film in like 2007, I think, called Americano, that he directed and produced, that starred Dennis Hopper, Joshua Jackson. And so, he kind of did all that, the heavy grunt work to get going in that career. And I was doing my other thing. But we had kind of talked about maybe doing something together. And I had started being involved with some of his commercials that he was doing, and really liked that process. And so, what happened was in January 2010, there was the big earthquake that struck Haiti. Right around that same time, like I think it was 4 days later, my stepdad, so my stepbrother's dad, passed away. And so there was like something like kind of emotionally that connected us as we're together, for like funeral and everything, to that story that was happening in Haiti. Eventually drew us there for what we didn't know. We kind of decided, let's go take some cameras and film and see what happens.
Well, let's turn to the documentary that I watched pretty recently, The Diamond King. And this is a fascinating story. I'm really curious about how you found this story, how you ended up doing it, and then learning a little bit more about the process as well. So first of all, have you always been interested in baseball?
Yeah, always been a baseball fan, played baseball all through my youth, played through high school, went to Richland High School. 1999, we won the state championship. So, and kind of, that was like the beginning of a bit of a dynasty that Richland has had. I think there's like 6 state championships now. And so, and had some opportunities to play in college. I was a little bit burnt out by then. I was a pitcher, had an arm injury that I was going to have to kind of rehab from, and decided to hang up the cleats, and then ended up at Washington State, which I wasn't going to play baseball there. It was kind of smaller schools that I was being recruited for. But baseball's always been my favorite sport. I got away from it a little bit, like in my maybe like mid to late 20s, early 30s, but then started getting back into it. And then my wife and I had our son, who's 14 now, but he didn't really get into it until like 4 or 5 years ago. And so once he got into it, and we're Seattle Mariners fans, we all as a family really got back into it. So that's been a lot of fun. And then also it directly led to this film, The Diamond King, which is about an artist named Dick Perez. So it's the way that I'm kind of describing is it's the history. It's a history of baseball as told through the life and work of baseball's Picasso, Dick Perez. So Dick Perez has painted literally thousands and thousands of baseball paintings. He was the official artist of the National Baseball Hall of Fame for over 20 years, which had afforded him a lot of those opportunities to paint the whole history of the game from the 1800s until today. And but when I first kind of came across this story, I didn't know any of that. How it happened was my son and I were looking through my old baseball cards, and I came across some cards that Dick Perez painted in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid collecting. And those cards were called the Diamond Kings. So he painted those from 1982 to 1996. And they were hugely popular cards. As part of the brand that made those was Donruss. And he did one player for every team every year. And one thing I just kind of put together recently was when you do the math, because so he did 30 paintings or 26 paintings. And then when there was expansion, he ended up doing 30 every year. But those were printed, each one of them, millions of times because the baseball card explosion happened around then. So he has literally billions of these cards of his work that have been reproduced, which probably puts him right in the top just handful of artists in the history of art when it comes to reproductions, which I find kind of fascinating. But when I was looking through these cards with my son, it just, right away it took me back to my childhood. I hadn't seen him for a long time. And, here's a painted baseball card of like Ken Griffey Jr., Bo Jackson, some of my favorite players as a kid. And it was just the thought of, oh, I wonder what the story about this artist is. Like that's how it all started. And then he's got a great website, dickperez.com, where you can get kind of lost for days just looking at all the art that he's got on there, which is what I did. I went to the website, and had I discovered that this was the guy that did the Diamond Kings, I would have been like, oh, cool. And I'd learn a little bit more about him, but that would have been it. I wouldn't have thought like, oh, this is a documentary film. But that's where I found out about, that he had painted the whole history of baseball, thousands and thousands and thousands of paintings. He had a really unique and interesting life story that was kind of detailed on the website a little bit. And so pretty quickly, like that day, I started thinking that this could be something a little bit bigger than just, curiosity. Like it could be an actual movie. And so I emailed him, I think that day. I found an email address on his website, emailed him that day. He got back to me within like a day or two. And then we had a conversation and hit it off on the phone. And we just kept it really casual, which was, he lives in Brooklyn. And so I was going to be in New York already in like a month and a half. And so I said, why don't I just stay a couple extra days, bring my camera, and we'll shoot a little bit and see how it goes and see if we get along. And we did. We hit it off right away, got along really well. And that's how it all started.
Oh, that's great. Don't you just love it when you find a story like that?
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. Like, you've got to love the process and enjoy, and you kind of asked about that too. Like, what was the process? I mean, really, that's got to be first and foremost, is just enjoying what you're doing. In documentary film, any sort of art, right? There's, there are ways to make money. There's certain projects that are financially lucrative, but also like you never know what those are going to be. And so and there's so many things that you can't control or predict in the marketplace. And so first and foremost, you've got to really find something that you're going to enjoy doing. And getting back into baseball, getting into this story because of my son, and then hitting it off with Dick and just being able to make something, where I'm surrounded with baseball art. I felt like, this will be a fun project to do. And then Dick and his family are just great people. So getting to know them and the process was actually pretty fast for me. It was just a little over 2 years to make the film, which seems like a long time, but it's also not for a feature-length documentary. Yeah, so I mean, the process really is like what's gotta be most important first and foremost, having fun with it, and that's the part that you can control.
This film really kind of shows the other side of that too, with Dick Perez himself and the joy he had in his work. That's one of the things that really struck me about the documentary is how warm it was and how enthusiastic he was, not just about baseball, but also his role as an artist in creating these beautiful pieces.
I asked him once. I don't think it's in the film, but I asked him, would you would you prefer to be thought of, remembered as a great artist or for your contributions in the history of baseball? And immediately he just said artist, like he's an artist first. His subject matter just happened to be baseball. He loved baseball, loves baseball still. I mean, it's his kind of first love. He wanted to be a baseball player before he was a painter, but ultimately it's also just the thing that kind of like fortuity led him to these jobs painting baseball. And but he's a painter first, and and you see the love. I mean, somebody in the movie, John Thorne, who's the official historian for Major League Baseball, he says that his work is love on canvas, and I think you really see that. And that was one of the things that we had to kind of figure out in the making of the film, is how do we honor the art, and is there a way to kind of even like do something to it as a film where we're not hopefully distracting, but we're even elevating a little bit. So I'm sure you notice there's like, subtle movement in the paintings, like if a ball's being pitched, like it's moving. And so trying to bring it to life a little bit, even though like the work, even though it's a painting and it's static, it has life, but we wanted to see like, can we bring it to life a little bit? And I think we did a pretty good job with that. So does Dick, which is good. I did wonder, like, what's he gonna think when he sees, what we did to his art. But one of the things that was awesome about this whole process was from early on and throughout, he, would reiterate, like, no matter what I want to do, it's mine to do. He's not going to step on anything or make anything difficult or say no to anything, because as an artist, he wants that freedom. And so he wanted to make sure that I was afforded that freedom as well, too, which is great.
That's great. Actually, I had that on my mind. Asked to ask you about the effects, which I found really good, very subtle, but at the same time, just that little bit of movement that brought the already lively paintings to further life. So I really appreciated the effects in there.
Yeah, thanks. And I think what I wanted to kind of try to do was allow people to imagine even more that painting is happening and it's live, and it's like you're at this game that just is happening in a painting, because there's not actually one frame of Major League Baseball in the whole movie. It's all painting. There's a little bit of baseball archival, like 1950s Harlem, which was would have like kind of been Dick playing in the streets with his friends in the early 1950s in Harlem when he came there from Puerto Rico. But there's no actual like professional baseball being played in the whole movie. It's all shown through paintings, but I wanted to kind of have the viewer feel like they're watching baseball.
Yeah, I could definitely sense that. And I also really liked how you told the history of baseball, like you said, through art, and really looking at every aspect, including, when baseball had to break out of its older traditions and start accepting, Black players and expanding and becoming even more of America's game. Was that always in your mind, as a way of kind of storytelling alongside, maybe parallel with Dick Perez's story, this story of baseball and its transformation?
Yeah, really from like the day that I had an idea that this could be a film, that component was in my mind. It was what can I add on top of like Dick's story, which I was inspired by, but I felt like I don't want to say it wasn't like enough for the film, but I just felt that the best film had to have like another layer to it. And so, and when I realized that he had painted, again, thousands of paintings, and that literally you can look at his work and you can get a history of baseball. You see how the game started in the late 1800s, how it changed from the uniforms and the signs at the fields and the stadiums themselves to the players on the field, starting out, entirely white, and then, with Black players, with Latin players, how it's all changed, scoreboards, people in the stands, all of how they dress. You can see the entire history through his work. And one thing I realized kind of more recently too, we're getting ready probably in July, I think we're going to do a couple screenings in San Francisco with the San Francisco Giants. And so I thought, oh, well, what does it look like if we look at Giants paintings that Dick did going back to the New York Giants, which, they were, from the late 1800s, early 1900s, before they moved to San Francisco. And sure enough, you can see a whole history of the Giants franchise in his work. And I've looked at some other teams too. It's like, you can. He has an exhibit at Citizens Bank Park, which is where the Philadelphia Phillies play. He's got, I think, 35 paintings there now of Hall of Famers that played for the Philadelphia Phillies, the Philadelphia A's, or that were like native Philadelphia area players that made the Hall of Fame. And again, you see the whole history of baseball when you walk through that exhibit there. So it was pretty early on. I wanted to do that. A book that had come out fairly recently at the time when I first started this project was called The Baseball 100, written by Joe Posnanski. And it was a big time #1 New York Times bestselling book. And he structured the book by the 100 greatest players. So number 100, for instance, was the first chapter, and it was I think he had Ichiro as number 100. But the way that he writes is, he might not say the name Ichiro until like page 5 of that chapter. It's like got all these other things about baseball that lead up to it. And then ultimately he gets to his little Ichiro thing. And so I liked that idea of like in his book, you get a whole history of baseball, even though you're only talking about 100 players. Or focusing on 100 players. So I thought, can we do a history of baseball kind of inside of this Dick Perez movie as somebody that's painted the whole history? And we're not touching, of course, on, the whole history, but I think when you watch this film, if you're paying attention, both with the stories we tell and the visuals, that you'll see it. It all plays out. So that was kind of what I had in mind from the very beginning. And the way to do that was, with Dick's story, show as much art as possible. And having this idea of an on-camera narrator that would, from time to time, pop up in these scenes that were more specific about baseball. He'd be surrounded by Dick's work of whatever he's talking about. And so we were able to, so that same writer of the Baseball 100, Joe Posnanski, I got to write those scenes that ended up being in The Diamond King. And then they were acted by John Ortiz, who's an actor that I've, admired and were lucky enough to get for the film as well, too. So, yeah, that was all, I didn't have John and Joe like signed on, until later, but that whole concept was from pretty much day one.
Well, I really liked it. And I loved John Ortiz and the way that he presented too as a narrator, added kind of these almost chapter breaks in the documentary.
Yeah, the idea was like
they'd
be like a little bit separate, but still, hopefully not take you out. And then they kind of come together at the end when we kind of break the fourth wall. It's like, why am I narrating the film? It's, he's a huge baseball fan. And we actually made kind of a dream of his come true recently. Last month at a Mariners game, he threw out the first pitch. I think it was the movie came out on VOD April 25th, and I think it was April 26th the next day. He threw out the first pitch in the Mariners game for the Diamond King. We had a little clip up there, but as such a big baseball fan and as somebody, he dreamt about being a major league player, to be on that field and throw, maybe not a strike, but a pretty good pitch. He was like a little kid out there.
Kind of speaking of Mariners and stepping back to Ichiro Suzuki, who's, great player. One of the things I really enjoyed in the documentary were some of these little mini stories that you had captured in there, like the story about Ichiro wanting, the one painting and having himself in that painting.
Yeah.
I loved that and the Joe DiMaggio story, which were both really fun. Can you talk a little bit about those mini stories within the story?
Yeah, and the Ichiro one comes to mind. I'll see if I can think of a few others as we're talking, but those just kind of come in the interview. So process wise, certainly not every documentary has interviews. All mine have and do, versus, you could do something that's like pure verite where you're just capturing whatever's happening. Or there's films that are maybe all archival. And so you're telling a story that happened in the past, all with, archival footage that had been documented during that story. But generally the stories, I guess, that I'm attracted to, there is going to be some sort of like, interview component, especially of course if the people are still living, you spend time with them. But I always start out with an interview, and there's always an idea that you could like throw the interview away. It could just end up being research purposes. But in this case, I think we had like the main master interview was maybe an 8-hour, 2 4-hour days, back-to-back days, And then we shot several other ones, like as we were editing, as we realized we needed some things, we, schedule some times too. But those stories just come out of the interviews. So, I do as much research as I possibly can to know everything that I could possibly know about the subject and their story. But then you're just also, and then there's things too, asking that are like not, like biographical at all, but more like kind of deeper. And then you just got to always be alert and aware of like where the story's going. What do they reveal that you didn't know, that you were surprised by? And so certainly there were some of these like fun little stories, like the Ichiro story of Ichiro seeing a painting of Dick Perez at the Hall of Fame and wanting to buy it. They said, well, you can't buy it. It's a gift. It's the museum owns, it's not for sale. And so he ended up getting Dick Perez's name and contacted him and said, can you like do this painting for me essentially? And Dick at first didn't want to really do it because he doesn't, like duplicate his paintings like that. But ultimately he talked him into it. And, but before he started, he said, but I want you to put me and my dog and my wife in there. And Dick's like, well, this painting is 1950s Harlem. You're, you weren't born yet. And you're from Japan, and he's yeah, I know, but I love it. So anyway, so he sends Dick pictures of him and his wife and his dog, and Dick paints him in there, and so it's a fun story. I did try to get a quick interview with Ichiro for the film, and he sent a nice note just saying how much he cherishes that painting. It hangs in his place in Seattle, but he just never does interviews. I'm sure he will be. He's done one with Bob Costas, I think, for a Ken Burns, like the updated baseball documentary that he did a while back. And I'm sure he'll be doing some. He's going to the Hall of Fame this year, so I'm sure he'll be doing some more. But he just, basically said, I say no to everything, so I got to keep saying no to this. And there's a nice moment where Dick talks about Hank Greenberg, who was a star player for the Detroit Tigers in the 30s. He ended up getting a portrait that Dick Perez did of him, and he wrote Dick a nice note saying that he's going to hang it up next to his Gauguin painting that he had, and so just kind of fun stories like that. Or when Dick talks about his World Series ring, and Picasso doesn't have a World Series ring, Matisse doesn't have one, but Dick does. So like part humor, part just kind of like telling the story. And then I think it reveals fun things about Dick's character as well too. And then there are other things like not to give it away to people, listening that haven't seen it, but there's a thread about his relationship with his mom that, that's not published anywhere. That's not like something that Dick had talked about in interviews or put on his website. And it was just something that came out of our interviews and our conversations. And it was curiosity for me because I would pick up on some things about their relationship. And I just felt like there's something more there that I want to kind of pursue. And it ends up being, leads you to the very end of the film, which is one of my favorite, scenes of the entire film. And that's something that I had no idea going into. Dick didn't think we, have any idea that was going to be the kind of thing that was in this film, but you just kind of, uncover that as you go.
Yeah. Those kind of revelations were, they really gave some emotional resonance to the story. And I loved the comment in the ring. I laughed out loud about that one.
Yeah.
World Series ring. So do you still collect baseball cards?
A little bit, yeah. My son, so he didn't get into it like when he was like 7, like I did. It wasn't until he was like 11, and so we had a couple years where he was really into it, and I got back into it with him. And then he's 14 now, and this year he hasn't been quite as into it. So I'm off screen here. I'm looking at like I got these stacks of cards that would either need to be like filed away, or we would also like this is kind of fun, like we would sell cards too that like didn't really mean much to us, mostly to be able to buy more. It was something that kind of had to like fund itself. So I've got to kind of figure out what to do here, but I still definitely am interested. I think I'd be interested in starting to get into more like vintage cards from like the beginning days of baseball cards, late 1800s, early 1900s cards. I love that era of baseball. And I know like it was also Dick's favorite era to paint just because the uniforms are so cool. And so I think that's where in the future my interest would lie with collecting is just like some really old cards.
Well, they show up in the documentary too. I Remind me, what was the name? Something in Ginter?
Yeah, Allen and Ginter was one of the
Allen and
was
Ginter.
one of the early card sets, and it was actually cigarette packs. So they started doing cards of like baseball players, and just kind of like I guess if pop culture was a thing, then like kind of people that were big in pop culture somehow athletically. Like there was like a sumo wrestler was in the set. There was a sharpshooter, Annie Oakley was in the set, and there was like 8 baseball players or something. So those were some of the first baseball cards, and those were paintings. You know, they didn't have photography yet, so those were paintings made into cards, and those were an inspiration that Dick Perez had when he first started and wanted to do art in baseball cards, was because it hadn't been done, you know, for a long time. And so, but those Allen and Ginter cards were definitely one of his major inspirations. I don't have any of those. I've got a couple cards that are T206 cards, which the most famous one of those is the Honus Wagner card that's worth, you know, millions of dollars. I have one card from that set, which is Fred Merkle, who is famous for a play called Merkle's Boner in 1908. And I've always just thought that was a funny play. And so I got the Fred Merkle card from that set.
Do you have any other favorite cards?
Yeah, I mean, the one card that I guess is sentimental, it turns out that it's not that rare because, you know, there were so many cards being printed when I was a kid, but is the 1989 Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck rookie, just because he was mine and, you know, everybody's hero then, and that was like the hottest card. So that would be like the card that kind of, you know, takes me back, like, the, you know, we all wanted that card. And so that would probably be one. And I've started collecting a lot of Dick's work since doing this project, just because I started, you know, I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the work. So
I've learned a lot from the documentary, which is one of the things I love about documentaries, is when I learn something that I didn't really know about. You know, I didn't collect baseball cards, but thank you for kind of bringing that story to light, because it's a fascinating tale of the sport and art all combined.
yeah, two of my favorite things. It's available now. You can watch it on VOD. So it's a rental or purchase. It's $4.99 to rent, $12.99 to buy, and that can be found on like Apple, Amazon, Google Play. I think even YouTube now has a rental. So if you're a fan of baseball, fan of art, just an inspiring story, which is what I think this is. It's somebody that, you know, battled a lot of adversity at a young age to reach the very pinnacle of a career and a profession. So I'm super inspired by Dick's story in a lot of different ways. And I've heard from a lot of people that are like, I don't really care about baseball, but, you know, I loved this movie. And so I hope people will check it out.
Thanks for listening. You could find links to a magazine story about the Diamond King documentary, Perez's website, and more in the show notes. If you want to hear more WSU stories about interesting alums, campus life, and research, please subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. And if you have an idea for an episode, let us know at magazine.wsu.edu/contact. This episode was produced by me, Larry Clark. Our music is by WSU Emeritus Music Professor and Composer Greg Yazanitsky.